Welcome to AI History of Western Philosophy. Today we're diving into something that seems, well, almost too simple to be philosophical. What exactly is motion?
It feels so basic, doesn't it? We see it everywhere.
Exactly. The trees swaying, a bird flying, even just walking across the room. Movement feels completely fundamental, part of the furniture of reality.
We rarely stop to even question if it's possible.
But what if I told you that one of philosophy's oldest, most persistent arguments suggests that motion, the way we usually think about it, is actually impossible, fundamentally flawed?
It's a truly mind-bending thought, a real challenge to, well, to common sense, to everything we experience.
And it's a challenge that has echoed down through the centuries, hasn't it? From the ancient Greeks who first cooked up this intellectual puzzle, right up to thinkers grappling with the dawn of cinema.
Absolutely. It turns out this seemingly simple concept of movement has acted like a philosophical diagnostic tool. It reveals the deep-down assumptions, the sort of hidden metaphysical machinery of entire eras.
Right. So our mission in this episode of AI History of Western Philosophy is to really trace this fascinating family tree of the idea of motion. We want to follow the line from ancient Greece right into modernity.
We'll start with Zeno of Elea, obviously. His paradoxes are infamous for a reason. They've stumped brilliant minds for, what, over 2,000 years.
And then we'll jump forward, way forward, to the turn of the 20th century. We'll look at Henri Bergson and his, frankly, revolutionary take. He argued Zeno's paradoxes weren't real problems at all, but false problems.
Generated by a flawed way of thinking about time itself, which is a radical claim.
Totally. And then to bring it even closer to our time, we'll get into Gilles Deleuze. His re-engineering of Bergson's ideas for, well, the age of cinema, the age of mechanical images, is just audacious.
And how cinema, surprisingly, becomes a key for Deleuze, a way into understanding movement, not an example of illusion.
Exactly. So stick with us. You'll find out not just why Zeno's arguments stuck around for so long, but how they got radically reinterpreted. And ultimately, how this whole debate forces you, the listener, to rethink not just movement, but maybe how you conceive of reality itself.
Yeah, get ready to have your basic understanding of motion and even how we think about thinking kind of unpacked. Let's dive in.
Okay, so let's start with what some call the Elaic gambit. What was Zeno of Elea really trying to say with these paradoxes?
Well, as you said, they've been around for over 2 millennia, constantly challenging our basic assumptions about motion, space, time, change.
And the amazing thing, I think, isn't whether you can solve them like some kind of math riddle.
No, that's not really the point, is it?
Right. Their real power lies in how they act like X-rays for our hidden assumptions. They diagnose these deep metaphysical beliefs we hold about reality, often without even realizing it.
That's spot on. Because when people first hear Zeno's paradoxes, especially the famous ones like the dichotomy or Achilles and the tortoise, the immediate reaction is often, I can solve this with math.
It's like an intellectual reflex, isn't it? This sort of seduction of the mathematical solution. We think, oh, numbers and equations can fix any logical tangle.
And you can see why. Let's take the dichotomy. Zeno says, okay, imagine a runner needs to cross a track. To do that, they first have to cover half the distance. Right?
Makes sense.
But once they've done that, they still have the second half left. So they have to cover half of that remaining distance.
And then half of what's left after that.
Exactly. And then half of that and so on, infinitely. Zeno's challenge is, how can anyone possibly complete an infinite number of tasks covering these endless smaller and smaller distances in a finite amount of time?
It just sounds impossible when you put it like that. Your intuition screams, no way.
And the Achilles and the tortoise paradox has a very similar perplexing structure. You've got Achilles, the super fast hero, giving a slow tortoise a head start.
A classic setup.
Zeno claims Achilles can never overtake the tortoise, because by the time Achilles gets to where the tortoise started, the tortoise has already moved a little bit further ahead.
Okay.
Then, when Achilles covers that little distance to reach the tortoise's new spot, the tortoise has moved forward again. Another tiny distance.
So there's always another gap, infinitely small, but always there.
Precisely. It creates this infinite sequence of catch-ups that Achilles has to perform.
Yeah.
Each time he reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise is already somewhere else. It seems he can get infinitely close, but never actually pass it.
So, okay, if you come at these with modern math, say post-17th century calculus.
Right. With tools from Newton, Leibniz, and then later, more rigorously, people like Cauchy and Weierstrass in the 19th century with their epsilon-delta definition of limits.
Then these paradoxes look like standard problems involving infinite geometric series.
Exactly. For the dichotomy, you're summing 12 plus 14 plus 18 plus 116 and so on. And mathematically, we know that series converges. It adds up exactly to 1.
And the time taken adds up too, right? So an infinite number of steps can be done in finite time.
Mathematically, yes. The series converges. That's the standard solution in math and physics classes today. Problem solved, move on.
But, and this is the big but, isn't it? This is where the philosophical evasion creeps in. While that math is elegant and, works for launching rockets,
Absolutely essential for physics.
does it actually answer the question Zeno was asking? It tells us how to sum the parts, but does it address Zeno's original, more fundamental Eleatic question?
That's the crux. Zeno wasn't, as far as we can tell from ancient sources like Aristotle, primarily concerned with infinite series summation in our mathematical sense. His worry was conceptual. It was about the logical problem of completing a task that seems to involve an infinite number of stages.
So the math solution kind of assumes the answer from the start. It assumes space and time can be infinitely divided and traversed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It presupposes the very nature of the continuum that Zeno was calling into question. Zeno was challenging the coherence of thinking. Reality is made of infinite points while allowing movement through those points. The math describes motion within an accepted framework. It doesn't justify the logical possibility of that framework itself against Zeno's challenge.
So Zeno wasn't just being tricky with math. He was digging at the foundations of how we think about reality. And this makes more sense when you understand his motivation, right? Which brings us to Parmenides.
Parmenides' shadow looms large here. Zeno's paradoxes weren't just random brain teasers. They were, as Plato and Aristotle tell us, carefully crafted logical weapons.
Forged to defend the philosophy of his teacher, Parmenides of Elea, which was, let's face it, a pretty radical philosophy.
Extremely radical. The Eleatic school, Parmenides' school in the 5th century BCE, pushed metaphysical monism, the idea that reality is fundamentally one to its absolute limit.
So Parmenides argued that ultimate reality, what he called being or to eon,
Is a single, eternal, indivisible, totally unchanging, and completely motionless whole.
which flies in the face of everything our senses tell us.
Completely. His argument, laid out in his poem On Nature, starts with this stark choice. The way of truth, which says what is and cannot not be, versus the forbidden path of thinking about what is not. You can only think and speak of what is.
And from that seemingly simple premise, what is.
He logically derived all those startling properties of being. Change is impossible because something would have to become what it is not, or move into a space where it's not. But is not, non-being, can't exist or be conceived. Therefore, no change, no motion.
And no plurality either, no separate things.
Right, because for things to be separate, you'd need empty space, a void conceived as non-being between them. If non-being is impossible, there's no separation. Everything is one solid block.
So the world we see, full of different things moving and changing.
That's just the way of opinion for Parmenides. It's deceptive, an illusion based on faulty senses. True reality, grasped by reason alone, is static and unified.
Okay, so Zeno steps in as the defender, the polemicist.
Exactly. He uses reductio ad absurdum proof by contradiction. His strategy wasn't to directly prove Parmenides right, but to show that the alternative view, the common sense belief in many things in motion, leads to even greater absurdities and contradictions when you think it through logically.
Like Plato has him saying in the Parmenides dialogue, Zeno wanted to show that assuming existences are many leads to still more absurd results than assuming they are one. He's turning the tables.
Precisely. And seen this way, the paradoxes form a unified assault. The dichotomy and Achilles attack the idea of infinitely divisible, continuous space. If space is infinitely divisible, they argue, traversing any finite distance requires completing an infinite sequence of steps, which seems logically impossible. It leads to paralysis.
But he didn't stop there. What about the arrow paradox? That seems different.
It is. It attacks the problem from the angle of time, specifically the idea of time as composed of discrete instants. Zeno says, look at a flying arrow at any single instant.
Okay.
At that precise instant, it occupies a space exactly equal to itself. It's there, in that spot.
Which means it's not moving within that instant.
Correct. At that instant, it's at rest. But if time is just a collection, a sum, of such instants where the arrow is always at rest, well, then the arrow is always at rest. Motion must be an illusion.
Because motion requires difference between moments, not just a series of static snapshots.
Exactly. And then there's the less famous stadium paradox, which gets complicated. It basically showed contradictions arising whether you assume space and time are discrete or continuous. He's covered all bases.
So the combined effect was to force a choice.
Yes. Either embrace the contradictions you run into when you logically analyze motion and plurality, or accept Parmenides' coherent, though deeply counterintuitive, vision of a motionless, unified being. Zeno's real target wasn't just physics. It was the ontological foundation, the very possibility of being, for any worldview that allows change and multiplicity.
It's such a powerful challenge, and clearly it didn't just disappear, its legacy shifted, moving from pure ontology towards physics.
Aristotle was key here. He took Zeno very seriously, but tried to resolve the paradoxes in a way that saved motion. His big move was introducing the distinction between potential infinity and actual infinity.
How does that help?
Aristotle argued a line segment is potentially infinitely divisible. You can always imagine dividing it further. But it doesn't actually consist of an infinite number of points all existing simultaneously. Zeno, he claimed, wrongly treated a potential infinity as if it were an actual completed infinity.
So for Aristotle, you can traverse the line because it's not actually made of infinite points right now.
Right. This distinction effectively dissolved the paradoxes for physics, shifting the context away from Zeno's fundamental ontological challenge about the coherence of division itself.
And this shift, moving it into the realm of physics, continued into modern times, didn't it? Zeno keeps popping up in unexpected places.
He really does. The arrow paradox, for instance, has this weird, fascinating echo in quantum mechanics, the quantum Zeno effect.
Which sounds spooky. Is it just a name?
No, there's a genuine conceptual link. It's been experimentally shown that if you frequently measure a quantum system like an unstable atom about to decay, you can actually prevent it from changing or decaying.
Like watching a pot that never boils.
Kind of. Just like Zeno's arrow is supposedly motionless at every observed instant, continuously watching, the quantum system freezes its evolution. The act of measurement seems to fix its state.
That's bizarre. And other physics ideas get linked to Zeno, too.
Yes, some suggest Heisenberg's uncertainty principle resolves the arrow paradox. The principle says you can't know both an object's exact position and its exact momentum simultaneously. If you know its position precisely, like Zeno assumes for the arrow at an instant, its momentum is uncertain, it can't be definitively at rest.
So Zeno's premise is flawed from a quantum perspective.
Potentially. And then there's the idea of quantizing space-time itself, the possibility of a minimum length, the Planck length. If space isn't infinitely divisible, if there's a smallest possible pixel of reality.
Then Zeno's infinite regress in the dichotomy hits a bottom. It stops.
Exactly. It provides a physical cutoff. But here's the crucial point we keep returning to. All these modern physics approaches, fascinating as they are, continue Aristotle's move. They assume motion is real and look for models to describe how it works.
They're not questioning its fundamental logical possibility in the way Zeno was.
Precisely. They operate within a framework where motion is already accepted. Zeno was challenging the coherence of the framework itself. And this historical drift from ontology to physics and math really set the stage perfectly for Henri Bergson's intervention.
Right, Bergson wanted to pull it back to philosophy, but in a completely new way. This takes us to part 2, Bergson's reframing movement versus trajectory.
So turn to the 20th century, Henri Bergson arrives and basically says, look, everyone's been barking up the wrong tree for centuries.
He argued the whole debate about solving Zeno was misguided.
Profoundly misguided. His big claim: the paradoxes aren't real problems about reality, they are false problems.
False problems. Meaning
they are generated by a fundamental mistake in how our intellect tries to grasp reality, especially time and motion. His solution wasn't a new model of motion, but a diagnosis of the conceptual error that makes motion look paradoxical.
And this error is what he called the cinematographical mechanism of thought. That's such a great metaphor, especially for his time when cinema was brand new.
It's incredibly insightful. Bergson starts with a critique of the intellect itself. He says our intelligence evolved for practical action, for survival, not for deep metaphysical insight.
So it's designed to carve things up.
Exactly. To act effectively, we need to take the continuous flowing reality, which is always changing, and slice it into stable, discrete, manageable units. Like objects, states, positions. We focus on things rather than processes.
And the cinematograph, the early film projector, was the perfect analogy.
Perfect. Film creates the illusion of movement from a rapid series of static frames, right? Each individual frame is perfectly still.
The movement isn't in the frames themselves.
No, it's added externally, you could say, by the projector mechanism stringing them together quickly. Bergson argues our intellect does the same thing with reality. It takes instantaneous, static snapshots or views of continuous becoming.
Like freezing moments in time.
Yes, and then it strings these frozen moments together with an abstract concept of change or succession. It reconstructs a kind of functional imitation of movement, useful for getting around, but ultimately false to the reality of movement itself.
And this leads to the core mistake.
The core absurdity, as he saw it, trying to reconstruct movement with immobilities. You can't build real flowing movement out of static snapshots any more than you can build a living thing out of dead parts.
And this wasn't just about Zeno, was it? He saw this intellectual tendency everywhere in philosophy.
Oh, absolutely. This critique of the intellect's habit of creating static snapshots, of spatializing the temporal, applies broadly. He saw it in Plato's eternal forms, in Kant's fixed categories of understanding. Western thought, he argued, tends to privilege the stable, the fixed, the spatial over the fluid, the changing, the temporal.
So the fundamental error is treating time like space, like a line you can divide into points.
That's the root of it for Bergson. We represent time as a homogeneous, measurable line, divisible into instants, just like a line in space is divisible into points. But once you conceive of time as a series of discrete points or instants,
Then Zeno's paradoxes become inevitable. They just fall out of that model.
exactly. Zeno's arguments become, for Bergson, not refutations of motion itself, but brilliant demonstrations of the contradictions inherent in this flawed, spatialized model of time. If you think of movement as hopping from static point A to static point B, you've already killed the movement.
Okay, so if the intellect, with its snapshots and spatializing tendency, gets reality wrong, especially time and motion, how do we access the real thing? What's Bergson's alternative?
This brings us to his absolute core concept, dure real, real duration.
Real duration, what is that exactly?
It's time as we experience it directly, intuitively, before the intellect analyzes it and chops it up. It's not a sequence of discrete nows like clock ticks. It's a continuous, indivisible, qualitative flow.
Like music. You hear the melody flowing, not just isolated notes.
That's a classic Bergsonian analogy. In duration, the past isn't something left behind. It flows into and interpenetrates the present, and the whole thing swells forward into a genuinely novel, unpredictable future. He calls it a qualitative multiplicity. Its parts merge and blend. They aren't separate like objects in space.
It sounds much more organic, fluid.
It is. And for Bergson, movement is the most tangible experience we have of this duration. Think about a simple act, like raising your arm.
Okay.
You don't experience that as, say, position 1 at time 1, position 2 at time 2, position 3 at time 3.
No, it feels like one smooth action.
One single, indivisible, qualitative act. A simple intuition, he say. And this leads directly to his crucial distinction, the difference between movement and trajectory.
Movement versus trajectory. This sounds key for tackling Zeno.
It's absolutely central. The movement is the indivisible act itself, the qualitative process unfolding in real duration. Think of a gesture, a leap. The trajectory, on the other hand, is the path traced in space by the movement. It's the line left behind, the static record after the act is done.
Like the chalk line on a graph mapping where something went.
Precisely. That line, the trajectory, is divisible. You can mark points on it infinitely. But the movement itself, the act of moving, is an indivisible whole. To divide the act is to destroy it.
So Zeno's big mistake, according to Bergson,
Was confusing the properties of the trajectory, divisible, spatial, with the nature of the movement, indivisible, temporal. Zeno looked at the divisible line the arrow traced and wrongly concluded the act of flying must also be divisible into static positions.
he mistook the map for the territory.
Beautifully put. The statement movement is made of immobilities is, for Bergson, the fundamental fallacy. The intellect generates this fallacy, and Zeno masterfully exploits its contradictions. Bergson insists the arrow is never truly at a point. It passes through points.
To say it's at a point is to imagine it stopped.
Yes, even for a nanosecond. You've substituted an immobility, a static snapshot, for the living movement. It's like freezing a runner mid-stride and saying, see, they're at this coordinate. But the act of running isn't reducible to those coordinates.
So this whole approach basically reframes Zeno entirely. It's not an ontological problem about reality, it's an epistemological problem about how we know.
That's exactly it. The paradoxes don't reveal contradictions in reality. They reveal contradictions that arise when we apply the wrong tool, the spatializing intellect, to a reality that is fundamentally temporal and flowing. The problem lies in our method of understanding.
Which means Bergson wasn't interested in finding a better mathematical formula or a new physical model.
Not at all. In fact, he thought the calculus solution, while useful for engineers, actually perpetuated the cinematographical error. Why? Because it still accepts the idea of decomposing movement into infinitesimal immobilities, the points on the line, and then tries to reconstruct the whole flow by summing them up.
So calculus is still playing Zeno's game, in a way, still trying to build movement from non-movement.
That was Bergson's view. The only true solution is to reject the whole decompositionist project. Movement is primary, it's a given flow. You can't build it from static parts, however small or numerous.
So how do we grasp this primary flow, if not through the intellect?
Through intuition, which for Bergson isn't some vague feeling but a specific philosophical method, kind of intellectual sympathy, where consciousness tries to place itself within the flow of duration, grasping reality from the inside as an indivisible whole.
And if you manage that, Zeno's paradoxes just disappear.
They dissolve. They're revealed as artifacts of a flawed perspective, like looking at the world through distorting glasses. Take off the glasses, adopt the intuitive standpoint, and the paradox of the arrow vanishes once you grasp the flight as one indivisible act, distinct from the divisible line it creates.
It's a profound shift, moving the problem from physics back to philosophy, but then declaring it wasn't a real philosophical problem to begin with, just a symptom of bad thinking.
A radical reinterpretation indeed.
But the story doesn't end there. Decades later, another philosopher took Bergson's ideas and, well, went somewhere completely unexpected with them, especially regarding that very technology Bergson used as a negative example.
Which brings us to part 3, Deleuze's cinematic reversal, from illusion to image.
Right. So Gilles Deleuze, writing mainly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, stages this remarkable comeback for Bergson. His book Bergsonism in '66, and then his massive 2-volume work on cinema.
Cinema 1, the movement image, and Cinema 2, the time image, hugely influential.
In these works, Deleuze doesn't just explain Bergson, he actively rebuilds his philosophy.
And for a very specific goal, to create a new ontology, a new theory of being that was adequate for the 20th century, an age dominated by the mechanical image, by cinema. Right. But in doing so, he pulls off this incredible reversal.
He takes cinema, which Bergson saw as the ultimate symbol of the intellect's illusion-making,
And turns it into a privileged way of accessing reality, a new way of thinking about pure movement itself. It's quite a move.
So how did Deleuze approach Bergson? You said he wasn't just trying to be a faithful historian.
Definitely not. Deleuze's whole way of engaging with past philosophers, Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, Kant, was never about just getting them right in a historical sense. He saw them as holding conceptual toolkits.
Toolkits?
Yeah, collections of concepts that could be taken out, sharpened, modified, and used to build something new, something relevant to contemporary problems. His own big project was building this philosophy of immanence, of pure difference, directly opposing the mainstream Western tradition, especially Hegel. Bergson was a key ally in this, a non-Hegelian source of powerful concepts.
And this approach really brought Bergson back into the philosophical conversation, didn't it? Deleuze highlighted key aspects of Bergson's thought, but maybe gave them a Deleuzian spin.
Absolutely. He foregrounded 3 things especially. First, Bergson's concept of intuition. Deleuze presented it not as mystical guesswork, but as a rigorous method for finding differences in kind. Real qualitative distinctions in reality, not just differences of degree.
Okay, intuition as a precise method. What else?
Second, multiplicity. Deleuze seized on Bergson's distinction between quantitative, spatial, discrete, and qualitative, temporal, continuous multiplicities, and made it a central pillar of his own ontology. He constantly contrasts the actual multiplicity of divided space with the virtual multiplicity of undivided duration. This virtual-actual distinction becomes absolutely fundamental for Deleuze.
The virtual and the actual. That sounds important, especially for the cinema books. And the third thing?
Memory. Deleuze radicalized Bergson's theory of memory. He argued that for Bergson, the past isn't just psychological recall happening now. The past has its own ontological reality. It exists virtually, coexisting alongside the actual present that it once was.
So the past is real, but not currently actual.
Exactly. As Deleuze puts it, riffing on Bergson, only the present is psychological, but the past is pure ontology. The virtual isn't just potential, like something that might happen. It's a real dimension of being, like a vast reservoir of the past, constantly pressing on the present. Think of your own past, it's all there, virtually influencing you, even the parts you aren't consciously remembering.
Wow. Okay, so Deleuze extracts and retools intuition, multiplicity, and this virtual ontological past from Bergson. How does he then use this toolkit to analyze cinema?
This leads to his most audacious move, what we call the movement image, Bergson against Bergson. In Cinema 1, Deleuze goes right at Bergson's condemnation of cinema as the peak of this cinematographical illusion.
And turns it completely upside down.
Completely. He does it through a really clever strategic reading of Bergson against himself. He goes back to Bergson's earlier book, Matter and Memory, from 1896. This was before Creative Evolution, where the main critique of cinema appears, and crucially, before cinema was really a big deal culturally.
What did he find in Matter and Memory?
In that book, Bergson lays out this vision of the universe as composed entirely of images. An image, for early Bergson, is matter in motion. He states this triple identity: image, movement, and matter and movement image. The universe is this vast field, a plane of immanence, filled with movement images constantly interacting.
Okay, a universe of moving images. So Deleuze takes that early ontology.
And argues, wait a minute, if the universe is movement images, then it's natural perception, our everyday way of seeing, that operates cinematographically. We are the ones who take this universal flux and carve it up into static snapshots for practical action.
So we make the static frames, not the cinema.
Exactly. As living beings, centers of indetermination, we immobilize the flow to select what's relevant for our survival and action. When you perceive a cup, you're freezing a part of the matter flow into a stable object you can interact with. Our perception imposes stillness.
So cinema then does the opposite.
That's Deleuze's brilliant reversal. Cinema doesn't add fake movement to static frames, as later Bergson claimed. Instead, it takes static frames of film stills, and through montage, camera movement, projection, it restores movement. It liberates the image from our practical, subjective needs.
It gives us movement that isn't tied to our need to act.
Precisely. Cinema presents us with what Deleuze calls the movement image, defined as a mobile section of duration. Think of a long tracking shot following someone, or a rapid montage that shows us movement detached from our immediate sensory motor needs. It gives us a purer, more direct image of movement itself, breaking free from our human-centered way of carving up reality.
So cinema becomes a solution, not the problem. It overcomes the limitations of our own perception.
That's the core of the reversal. Deleuze uses early Bergson's ontology, universe movement images, to refute late Bergson's epistemology, cinema illusion. He argues Bergson actually theorized a fundamentally cinematic universe but failed to recognize its actualization in film technology, maybe because he was so focused on the intellect's failings. For Deleuze, cinema is a new resource, a new image of thought.
And he didn't just make this claim, he built a whole system around it in Cinema 1, a taxonomy of movement.
Yes, it's incredibly systematic. He develops a whole classification of different types of movement images, derived directly from his reading of Bergson's sensory motor schema, the circuit in a living being, from perception through internal affect to action.
Okay, what are the main types?
He identifies three fundamental kinds. First, the perception image. This corresponds to how we select information from the world. In film, it's basically the shot, how the camera frames reality, what it chooses to show us, the point of view.
Like choosing what the camera perceives.
Exactly. Second, the affection image. This corresponds to the gap, the internal reaction between perceiving something and acting on it, the realm of feeling, emotion, quality. In cinema, its prime example is the close-up, especially the facial close-up, which isolates affect from action. Think of pure fear or joy on a character's face.
The inner state, and the third.
The action image. This corresponds to the response, the action taken in the world. In film, this is the basis of most traditional narrative cinema characters reacting to situations, overcoming obstacles, achieving goals. The classic Hollywood plot, basically.
Perception, affection, action. And he developed this further.
Oh yes, much further. He brings in the semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce to create this incredibly complex cine system, classifying different film styles and genres based on which type of movement image dominates and what kind of time they imply. It's a massive project of film theory grounded in Bergsonian philosophy.
It really shows how he wasn't just repeating Bergson, but using his ideas as an engine for something entirely new, a philosophy of cinema.
Precisely. Which brings us right back to that tricky question of fidelity. This is part 4. Creative appropriation or faithful extension.
Yeah, this relationship between Deleuze and Bergson is fascinating. Deleuze clearly did a huge service in reviving Bergson, making him relevant again. But his interpretation is so, well, Deleuzian, that people argue about how Bergsonian it really is.
It's a constant debate. Was Deleuze just using Bergson as a mask for his own ideas, or was he genuinely extending Bergson's thought in a legitimate, if radical way?
How do we even judge that? Do we compare line by line?
I think Deleuze himself gives us the criteria. He was very open about his method. He wasn't interested in being a faithful historian, meticulously documenting what Bergson really meant. He saw philosophy as the creation of concepts.
And encountering past thinkers was about generating new possibilities.
Exactly. It was about finding tools in their work to tackle current problems. He used that famous, slightly shocking metaphor.
Taking a philosopher from behind to produce a monstrous offspring.
Right, an offspring that's recognizably related to the parent, but also startlingly new, maybe even something the parent wouldn't recognize or approve of. For Deleuze, this wasn't misreading. It was intentional.
Because a purely historical reading just mummifies the thought, traps it in the past.
That was his fear. A creative reading, even a willed misreading, keeps the thought alive, makes it productive now. So the question isn't, did Deleuze get Bergson historically right? But rather, is the philosophical entity he created, this cinematic Bergsonism, powerful, coherent, and useful? Does the monster work?
That's a different way to think about influence. So let's quickly recap the core positions on movement we've seen.
Okay. For Zeno, the problem was the logical impossibility of motion, given the nature of space, time, and division. His solution was denial. Motion is illusion, reality is one and unchanging. Key ideas being the one, reductio ad absurdum.
And then for Bergson, the problem wasn't reality, but our intellect's way of analyzing it, spatializing time via the cinematographical mechanism, his reframing. Zeno's paradoxes are false problems resulting from confusing indivisible movement with its divisible trajectory. Key ideas: durée, intuition, movement versus trajectory.
And finally, for Deleuze, the problem was that classical thought, maybe even Bergson himself ultimately, didn't fully grasp how to access movement directly. His solution: reframing. Cinema isn't the illusion, it provides the movement image, a direct presentation of a mobile section of duration. Key ideas: movement image, time image, the virtual immanence.
That progression shows a real transformation of the question itself, from denial to epistemological diagnosis to cinematic affirmation.
It really does. And looking at Deleuze and Bergson specifically, we can pinpoint the breaks and the links.
The most obvious break is cinema, right? Bergson condemns it, Deleuze elevates it.
Absolutely glaring. Bergson sees it as the epitome of the intellectual flaw. Deleuze sees it as potentially overcoming that flaw.
And the other big shift seems to be around durée and memory.
Yes, Bergson's durée is primarily lived, conscious, psychological time. Deleuze takes that and ontologizes it, turns it into an objective, impersonal, virtual dimension of reality itself, this past in general. It's a subtle but huge shift from a consciousness-centered philosophy to a more impersonal ontology.
But despite these big changes, you're saying there's still deep continuity.
Oh, undeniably. Deleuze's whole philosophy runs on fuel he gets directly from Bergson. The primacy of becoming over being change is fundamental. The focus on difference in itself reality is fundamentally diverse, not based on identity.
The value placed on intuition for grasping the real.
Yes, and the critique of the possible reality creates genuine novelty. It doesn't just actualize pre-existing blueprints. Deleuze is profoundly Bergsonian in these core commitments. You could almost argue he's more Bergsonian than Bergson in pushing these ideas to their absolute limits, even against Bergson's own conclusions about cinema.
So back to the monstrous offspring. Deleuze wasn't just hijacking Bergson.
I'd argue no. It was a deep, creative engagement. He saw something in Bergson, a virtual potential for a philosophy of cinema that Bergson himself didn't see or pursue.
So the movement image isn't what Bergson intended, but it's built using Bergsonian parts.
Almost entirely. The movement trajectory distinction, mobile sections of duration, the ontology of the image from matter and memory, these are all Bergsonian tools. Deleuze performed a creative actualization of potentials within Bergsonism. He did to Bergson's philosophy what Bergson's philosophy describes, the emergence of unpredictable novelty.
So the monster carries the parent's DNA, even if it looks different. Deleuze wasn't right about Bergson's intention for cinema, but maybe right about the latent power of his concepts.
That's a great way to put it. He unleashed Bergson's concepts for a new age.
What an incredible journey. We started with Zeno trying to freeze an arrow in time with logic, and we end up with Deleuze finding reality's flow in the moving images of cinema.
It shows how a philosophical problem doesn't just get solved and put away, it gets transformed.
Zeno used logic to defend a static reality, arguing motion was illusion.
Then centuries later, calculus offered a way to calculate motion, essentially neutralizing the paradox for physics, but maybe dodging the deeper philosophical issue.
Until Bergson flipped the script, calling the paradoxes false problems born from our intellect's flawed cinematographical way of thinking about the true flow of Dore.
And then Deleuze, in that final twist, claimed our perception is the illusion, and cinema could offer a direct movement image, realizing a potential Bergson himself missed.
It suggests that the philosophers after Zeno weren't just failing to understand him. Their constant wrestling with his ideas was a way of refusing his conclusion, of continually affirming that change and becoming are real.
And Bergson and Deleuze show that sometimes the best response to a problem isn't just finding an answer within the existing terms, but inventing a whole new way of thinking that makes the old problem look like a symptom of a limited perspective.
So we went from a static arrow to a mobile image. What does this whole philosophical arc tell us about philosophy itself?
Maybe that genuine understanding isn't about finding the final fixed answer that stops the conversation. Maybe it's about the ongoing creative moving power of thought itself, thought that constantly transforms the very questions we're asking.
Which leaves us wondering, what new images of reality, what new ways of thinking about fundamental concepts like motion might we create next?